Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We are very fortunate to have today the writer of what I believe to be the most extraordinary, no-holds-barred autobiography of recent times, Friends and Enemies by Barbara Amiel. She actually does, in the appendix of this book, list all her best friends and best enemies, which is the most extraordinary thing. There is a list of 48 people who she says are enemies of hers, which has, I don't think, ever been done before. And so I'd like to ask her about her life. And in particular, I'd just like to start off with a personal anecdote, Barbara, from the July of 1995, when in the days before Richard Dennon and Catherine Osler, the Tatler used to put out questions, letters, saying who's the sexiest woman in Britain. And I wrote on this letter, Barbara Amiel, obviously, and put it in the postbox. And I remember putting it in the postbox because I was in morning suit and I was walking to my wedding. Which, after it was published, after the honeymoon, my wife didn't find terribly funny. My first wife, that is. In this truly fabulous book, Barbara, you start off by saying, in the first sentence, in fact, here we are. There must be a way to get past the childhood years, so tedious for the reader unless you're reared by a troop of gorillas or have the writing skills of Emile Zola. But I would like to take issue with you on this, but of course you can't skip through the childhood years with you because your childhood is pretty central to the person you became, isn't it? You were born during the war, you were 8 years old when your parents divorced, nearly 12 when you went off to Canada, you were 16 when your father committed suicide. Actually, your early 15, your early years are actually crucial to understanding you, aren't they?
Look, I don't analyse myself. I mean, I write, I don't analyse what I'm writing. I don't know how much early years really do affect people. I know it's fashionable to say that they do. I think you just go along like a rolling stone and you gather up whatever is happening to you and put it to the best use you can. So my early years were a little unpredictable. They weren't, there wasn't a nice family bringing me up, but that was really rather fun. If you don't have parents when you're 14 and 15 to tell you what time to come home or something like that, it's a benefit as much as it's a handicap.
Well, you were very successful at school at the North London Collegiate, and then in Canada, successful at the University of Toronto. You went on to be a star on the Canadian, the CBC TV, wrote for Maclean's magazine, became the first woman editor of a Canadian newspaper or of the Sun?
First, well, I think the first female editor of a major metropolitan newspaper in Canada, although my assistant in Britain, who was a clipboard lady who was very precise about these things, said that I was the first one in North America. Well, that seemed a bit thick.
No, that is an extraordinary achievement. And so I know there are lots of young female journalists in the room. Have you got any advice apart from to do what you did, which was obviously work extremely hard?
You know, if I had anything to say, it's research. You cannot bloody well over-research when you're writing. And research isn't considered terribly important these days. But I think the key to getting ahead in your profession is to research, particularly if, like me, you have mildly unpopular views.
Well, actually, that was going to be my next question. Because although you started off on the left, you had a political conversion, a sort of Damascene conversion. Tell us about that.
Well, I was a delegate on the World Youth Festival in Helsinki, which is a Communist Front organization, in 1961. And I think that one of the Redgraves, and I believe it was Vanessa Redgrave, was on the group that went along. And I remember we got to East Germany, and I was still gung-ho because communism was going to make everybody equal and iron out all the disparities of wealth. And then I saw what had just been put up, and that was the Berlin Wall. And it was red, and it was raw, and you could touch it. And there was just no way. They told me all sorts of things. This wall is there to keep capitalists from going into East Berlin and raiding the shops, which had absolutely no goods in them whatsoever. And it really changed my mind, and I came back not a right-winger, and I don't like that term, right-wing, because socially I'm certainly not a right-winger. I'm pro-gay marriage, I'm pro-abortion, I'm anti-capital punishment, I'm economically conservative, no question about it. But, you know, there's a range of views, and I think pigeonholing people is a very dodgy thing to do.
How did you find being in that world of journalism in Canada in those early years? You know, tell us about them. What was it like?
Well, first of all, they weren't terribly keen on having a woman heading up a newsroom that had, I don't know, 1,500 men and papers across Canada. And so the story was obviously that I'd got the job by sleeping with someone, which I couldn't see anybody worth sleeping with to get the job. I would have done it if it were.
Hashtag Me Too moment. I'm not sure you're allowed to say that,
Well, I don't know if you know what you're allowed to say or not, because that's another one of the problems these days, isn't it? And that's something that I find terribly, very, very unhappy. And it almost brings out in me a perverse desire to say the wrong things.
There's about 500 pages of that in this book. It is wildly politically incorrect, this book. You're not denying that for a second, I hope.
Well, I don't know what's politically incorrect. I mean, I'm married, I divorced, I worked, I did the odd thing that might be considered sexually inappropriate today.
Well, we've got your fourth husband in the audience here, Conrad Black, and he's a very big and strong man, so I'm going to tread carefully over these the things you're supposed to have done.
I was very lucky. I made 3 very bad choices before Conrad, sort of ranging from psychopathic men to bad choices. And then I found Conrad, and I found Conrad at 51, which should give hope to all women reaching that stage of life. And when I first met him and he seemed to be interested in me romantically, I told him to get hold of Tacky. Remember Tacky?
Yeah, of course.
And find some younger women, because it was absurd for him to marry a woman who was 4 years older than himself.
But the dynamic, tell us about the dynamic between the two. You did say it in the last night. There
Yes.
were 2 things in particular.
Well, what really worked was that he had lots of long words that I didn't understand, so I wasn't quite sure what he was saying to me. And later on in our marriage, through the absolute incompetence of a hospital, he lost the sight of one eye. And therefore, in his eyes, I've always remained more beautiful than I am. And that makes a marriage perfect.
I don't think that's true at all. But there's also a very funny line in this book where you say that he's very interested in military history and that you would ask him to tell you about the Battle of the Somme if your sleeping pills weren't working. And I've written a book about the Battle of the Somme, so I could send you sleep at the drop of a hat. It's a 6-month battle, you know. Of course it does. Yes. It's impossible not to just go back and stay on the sexuality question one more time, because in this book you obviously you're an animal lover. That comes through strongly. And there was an occasion with one particular animal and some cream, and you're just going to have to explain to the audience how that happened, because
Look.
I've thought about it many times, and I really haven't been able to get the dynamics right.
The thing is, if you really grow up without a mother and father telling you what's right and wrong, and you have a reasonably independent nature, it seemed to me from very early on that nothing was out of bounds between people that liked one another or respected one another. I never did understand social mores terribly well. And I think the incident he's referring to took place in New York when I was in my late 20s and was still pretty good looking then, with hair down to my waist, which I had dyed blonde. I was going through my Faye Dunaway phase. And I saw an absolutely beautiful Afro-American who was walking a more beautiful Doberman Pinscher. It was the most beautiful Doberman I had ever seen in my life. And so I said to the gentleman, "That's a glorious dog, where did you get it?" And I suppose he thought I was doing a come-on, and I wasn't. I just absolutely love dogs. And he said, "Well, this, that, and the other." And we ended up in his apartment, and things took an unexpected turn, and I found myself naked on the floor, and the dog was there. And at some point, he went to the kitchen, and he brought out a tin of cream, of whipped cream. I don't think it was real cream, because if it was, I would have eaten it. But he sprayed it over me, and the dog began to lick it up. And I thought, this is when I had my first real worries about what was going on. Because I don't like the idea that a dog would be trained to do something like that. I mean, dogs should not be treated that way. And so I closed my legs very, very firmly and let the dog lick the cream off my tummy. And then as quickly as I could, if this is what you're referring to, I got my clothes and got the hell and blazes out of there. But
let's move on now to
look,
I'm glad I've asked that question, not least because
I'm not proud of it. I mean, it was when you're young, when you're in your 20s, you explore almost anything, don't you? I mean, you just...
Anyone here that would like to? Let's talk about your Jewishness. It became a big issue in the time that the French ambassador described Israel as a shitty little country at one of your dinner parties. And you mentioned that, and he didn't deny it, and I think it led ultimately to the ambassador leaving earlier than he would have.
Yes, I think he was relocated to Algiers.
Exactly.
And died there, which was, as I said, my first kill. And I was not that happy about it. You see, I thought he had every right, if he wanted to say that Israel was a shitty little country. I happen to very strongly disagree with him, but I don't disagree with people having the right to say these things. What intrigued me was that he was an ambassador of an EU country, and he felt that the times were such that he could say these things without any sort of anybody calling him out.
And it was at your table, wasn't it?
And it was at my table. And my husband, who had been wandering around doing the host thing, which I'm extraordinarily bad at, came to the table and heard it and thought he must have misheard it. So he asked the ambassador to repeat it, which he did both in French, which my husband is bilingual, and in English. And when I wrote about it, I did not name him as the French ambassador because it did take place in my house, but I said an ambassador of an EU country. And he identified himself to a very curious press. And after that, you see, I was wrong, really, because I wrote about it in a column, and by writing about it in the column became about whether my etiquette was right. Should I have mentioned something that went on in my own house? The column itself was, in fact, about the whole issue of what was being allowed to be said and what was going on with Hamas and Hezbollah. But I had muddied the waters by making this a social setting, putting it in a social setting. And so the column suffered. It wasn't read for what it was. It really became a discussion of, was I a bad hostess? Was I breaching journalism etiquette? And that was my own fault. I learned from that.
Have you come across much other anti-Semitism in your life?
Well, I think anti-Semitism, you have to be very careful using that phrase. I think there is polite anti-Semitism, which doesn't bother me a bit. In fact, rude anti-Semitism doesn't bother. Nothing really bothers me unless it involves violence. What does bother me is the double standard used about Israel as compared to the Arab countries surrounding it. It is, after all, a country which has an Arab party in the coalition government. I think at one point, am I not right, Conrad, it has an Arab attorney general. And it is a country that has the rule of law. And while it hasn't punished Israeli terrorists as much as I might like, it does put them in prison. Whereas in the West Bank, they drag bloodied Israelis through the streets. So I think if you can't use the same standard with countries around it as you do with Israel, you can't pretend that you're just being anti-Israel. You're being anti-Semitic. You can criticize a country all you like without being anti-Semitic, but you better bloody well use the same standard for the countries around it. And that's where I stand. And I wear this little Star of David around my neck for a very personal reason. I was married to a Hungarian Jew, and he was a splendid man who became my husband's closest friend, died recently, and they were very, very close. And he had been in hiding in Budapest when the Nazis came in. And first of all, he'd had to stitch the yellow star on his coat. And when we came to Canada, he went out and he bought me the most huge gold yellow star to wear around my neck. And he said that he couldn't wait to buy it in 18-karat gold after having to wear it as a patch on his coat. And I couldn't really wear one that huge. But I got myself a small one to wear in his memory, and because I thought the sentiment was rather special.
Let's talk about that interview you gave with Alice Thompson, the famous one in which you said that your extravagance knows no bounds. She wrote in that article that you had 100 pairs of Manolo Blahnik shoes, which immediately made you a pin-up to my wife and a total role model to an awful lot of people.
You know, that was not to Alice Thompson, although I gave a very nice, she was a lovely interviewer. It was to Julia something Neal, I think, for Vogue magazine.
Ah, I'm sorry.
And she was a brilliant interviewer. I liked her very much. And one of the things I had discovered when I was interviewing people were that people were so disinclined to show themselves to you. They'd only show you one room with carefully curated books, and you could never get anywhere. So I made it a rule when I was a journalist that I would never write a profile without spending at least 2 or 3 days with the person and moving around with the person. She came to my house, and so bearing this in mind, I said, Julia, go anywhere in the house you like. I'm going upstairs to make a cup of tea and hang myself, which is what I should have done, because she went around the house, and it's true. I had Manolo Blahnik shoes coming out of my ears. I mean, they were everywhere. And she wrote, and I said to her when she came back, and she said, you have so many things. And I said, well, you know, my extravagance knows no bounds. And it was actually related to a time when I was in college, and I had to buy my clothes second-hand. And this was in the late 1950s, and they didn't have sort of smart little vintage shops where everyone was terribly happy to be shopping. I had to go to real second-hand shops. And I went to a very smart party in Toronto in what I thought was a very smart outfit, except it had belonged to the daughter of the mother that was throwing the party. And she turned to me and she said, oh, my daughter had an outfit just like that, except it had a cigarette burn right. And there it was. And after that, I said to the interviewer, my extravagance knew no bounds. And it was a self-deprecating comment, but it came out and was used against my husband time and time again. And for that, I apologize to you today, Conrad, and I regret I said it.
Well, let's talk about Conrad and his travail. 17 years in the maw of the American judicial system before he was finally pardoned in May 2019. What was that? It seems a ridiculous question to ask because, of course, you write about it so fluently in this book. But what was that like for you? I remember when Conrad was about to go to jail, there were sort of talking clubland about whether or not you were a femme fatale who would therefore flit off to another husband. But of course you didn't. You stayed with him because it was a true love match. And what was that like?
Well, after I stayed with him, as the years went by, it turned to, well, she's too old to get anyone anyway.
That's
what
not
was
true.
it like? It was like falling down a lift shaft and never being able to see the bottom, because you didn't know what new thing would happen to you. In the American prosecution system, they would take all your money. They even tried to take away all my jewelry so I couldn't sell it to pay for lawyers' fees to help defend him. Fortunately, the one decent thing they did, if anything was decent in this, was the judge ruled that it was not bought with illicit funds, so I was able to sell most of it and get him decent lawyers. It was a terrible time, but Conrad, look, this is going to sound soppy, but Conrad is an extraordinary man. I watched him handle what anybody else would have wilted under. I mean, 10 years of about 10 to 15 articles a day saying how awful you are all over the world. Every day, 50 pages would come out of the fax machine, day after day after day. And he just knew he was innocent. The problem for me was I was a journalist. I had to be sure he was innocent. And that meant I had to do a lot of research into things that I did not understand, non-compete payments, various sorts of money transactions. It took a long time. And then when I realized, I knew in my heart that he probably was, but I had to know in my head. And when I realized he was completely innocent, the whole thing was absolutely easy. You just stuck. I loved him. I stuck by him. And he stuck by me, which I thought was even more extraordinary, because at one point he said, I would quite understand if you leave me. This was about 7 years into it, and I was visiting him at the prison. And the prison guards always used to give me a bit of a shakedown. They have these wonderful African-American women who are visiting their men. They were gorgeous. I longed to be a part of them because they really just went like that to the guards. And I was somewhat like this. And Conrad said to me, I would understand if you left me. Go and find a life for yourself because I don't know what's going to happen to me. And of course, there would be no life for me outside of him.
I'm certain the most moving parts of this book are where you talk about that. I remember when I went to visit Conrad in Florida, and he came in. I was expecting a broken man, and he looked like he just walked off a yacht.
I mean, wasn't it amazing? He would come out of that door where I knew he had just been strip searched. Bend over, let's see if you're concealing anything. And he would come into the visitation room, and he would smile at you as if this was his drawing room. Hello. He couldn't get, we couldn't get any food. They just have those horrible vending machines. But it was amazing. He never complained. He smiled. The guards came to respect him. Certainly the other prisoners did. He was the first white man ever asked to address Black History Month in prison. And he got a lot of the inmates graduating who couldn't read and write. And he set up a whole school with other prisoners there. And I still get sort of comments from their wives or girlfriends or grandmas. Mothers were never around much. Grandmas were. They were the strong women. Thanking him for that.
Just before I throw it open to the floor for questions, I'd like to put something else to you. You write in your first chapter, I wrote to be clever and to impress my father. But you didn't really write to be clever, did you? You wrote because you were clever. You had you've always been, you might have seemed to some people as a femme fatale, but actually you've always been the extremely hard-working girl from North Hendon, haven't you? Who will put in the hours doing the research for thousands of articles and who deserves everything that she's achieved in life, not because of your sexuality, but because of your ferocious intelligence.
That's really kind of you, but the fact is that I came, I had family up until the age of 11, and I came from a very competitive Jewish family. And I wrote to show them that I could be clever, and I loved my father, and the only thing that is ever a vulnerable spot is when interviewers ask me about my father, because that was, his suicide was the most devastating thing to me.
And you hadn't seen him for 3 years before?
I saw him, age 11, I stood on the 113 bus and waved goodbye to him, and then he just disappeared. And when I was 15, he did himself in. But I wrote to show his family that I could be clever. And then later on, I wrote because it was the only thing I had to barter. I could buy my way into friendships because I could win competitions and get prizes that I could share with other people. And it was the only thing I could do. And I loved it and I hated it. And if you think that it's been good writing, I'm glad. I've tried to do the best I can. It's never good enough, because my literary heroes are George Orwell and Albert Camus, and people who write economically. They don't waste words, and they write exquisitely.
Well, I think this book is exquisitely written. Are you going to write any more?
Yes, I'm writing a book now, and I will not tell you what it's about, but it's not about me. So therefore it may interest people more, and it's non-fiction, and fingers crossed it'll work. A lot of research.
Well, this book obviously is on sale afterwards at the bookshop, and Barbara is going to go there to sign. Do I see any questions about Barbara and her extraordinary life? Dambizo Moyo.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm a great admirer of what you've achieved. I don't think they make women like you anymore. Just really quite avant-garde, world traveler. One of the things I think is often missed, and it's in your book, but I'd love to hear from you directly, is about just sort of the human aspects. You have this list of enemies at the back. A lot of them were friends of yours. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that experience? How, and maybe any lessons you've learned about the way friends become enemies, and how you sort of went through being disappointed and let down by people who call themselves your friends during good times and perhaps not bad.
It wasn't a book of vengeance. I liked the title Friends and Enemies when all this started happening to us, because that's how I thought of the world. And there are more friends listed at the back than enemies. But it's a terrible thing when this is happening, and you've never thought about why people like you or don't like you, and you put out your hand at a gathering and their eyes just go by you and they don't see you anymore. You become invisible. And that was not crushing, but it hurt. It really did. There were a staunch group of girlfriends that stayed with me, and English. In Canada, I didn't really have any friends. The English are far more staunch and loyal than their North American counterparts. And the New York gang and the Palm Beach gang were pretty ghastly. I mean, they were pretty hideous. You had to have money, and you had to bring something to the table that would sit nicely on their shoulders. And when I didn't have that anymore, I didn't have them. With the exception of someone like Nancy Kissinger, Henry Kissinger's wife, who didn't care as much about her face and her facelifts, but cared more about keeping her brain young. And she remained a friend, and I've seen her since. But on the whole, and my Jewish friends in New York, the literary crowd, who never gave a damn about what they were wearing, but were really interested in ideas. People who were interested in ideas stuck with me. But the social life, the social things that I got when I was with Conrad, the grand life, if you like, that just went up in a puff of smoke, largely. And it's not pleasant.
Another question. There must be.
Am I that boring?
There is a lady there in the middle. Could you wait until you get a... and then when you do get your... when you get your microphone, there's a gentleman a couple rows behind you two who wants to ask a question after you. Madam.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed listening, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. One question I had, your Jewishness seems so important to you, and yet you say you don't mind about anti-Semitism. So I just wondered why you say that.
It's not that I don't mind about it. Of course I mind. It's just that I cannot bring myself to censor people saying silly or stupid things. Because once you start censoring people, there's no end to it. So I think people ought to be able to say what's on their mind. And frankly, speaking as a Jew, I think it's dangerous to us if we try and censor them. There was an anti-war parade years and years ago against the Iraq War in London. And the Jewish Deputy Board of Deputies, or whatever it is, heard that they were going to be carrying signs about kill the Prime Minister of Israel, hate Jews. And they went to all sorts of lengths to stop those signs. I thought that was wrong, because I think you need to know who your enemies are. If you push them underground, you don't know who they are, and you can't fight back. Now, I'm totally against violence, and I know that this hurts people, and I know that the generation before me, I'm the last generation that has any memory of the people that came out of the camps. And so for people who came out of those dreadful concentration camps, I understand why anti-Semitism would have a special, painful ring to it. But for us now, we shouldn't be telling people not to say what they think, whether they like Turks, whether they like Jews, words can't hurt me. Violence can, but words can't. And words can really hurt you if you keep them secret, submerged, and you don't know how people really feel.
But words can hurt a lot of people. So what is it about you that has given you this sort of rhinocerine hide against criticism and
Ask
hatred?
my dermatologist. I don't. I can get hurt. I really can. But there's a greater principle involved here. And the principle of free speech is absolutely precious, the principle of liberty. And sometimes free speech means you have to endure what seems unendurable. You have to endure people saying terrible things. And I know that, and the minority groups change. One minority group is in fashion at one point, then another group, then another group. And at the same time, some other group goes out of fashion. So you can never really keep up with it. You might as well just keep language open.
Do you feel, I mean, this is a literary festival, so obviously in a sense this is a festival of free speech. Do you feel that free speech is under threat now more than it has been over the last 20 years?
Well, it's under threat in publishers. I mean, Henry Kissinger is, whether you like his politics or not, a superb writer. Anyone who's read his memoirs know that. He is having difficulty getting, I think it's now being published, but getting his latest book published because he's white and he's old. And all the time I hear that people can't get their books published if they're of the wrong color, the wrong age, the wrong this, the wrong that. And that's a terrible thing. A book may be very good if it's written by an indigenous person. It may be a Nobel Prize winner if it's written by somebody who's transgendered. I don't care what shape, color, form you come in, but that should not be the deciding point about publishing it. It should be the quality of the prose. And that's changing in publishing houses. They can't afford to go against an increasing tide of wokeism. And that I find tragic.
Gentleman just behind, who put his hand up earlier.
Sorry, it's a lady.
I'm so sorry. There are very strong lights on me. But please, that was in no way a... and that's
It's
the
all
worst
right.
thing is that's not the first time I've made that mistake either. Madam.
No, I just wanted to ask about your career in journalism and what you think of the way that journalism is evolving now, especially with social media and its primary place in the way that we take in our news these days.
I think journalism's in a terrible mess. It seems to me that it's becoming so partisan that you can't find the truth. You have to become your own journalist. And it saddens me to see the print media in such, bad shape, with the exception of Tatler, which seems to be doing extremely well. And that's a shame. I think there is room for good journalism online, and that will sort itself out. Journalism cannot die. It's there to be an independent voice seeking the truth, and I don't believe that this temporary abandonment of standards in order to win readers in a time of change will continue. I have faith that great journalists, some of our best writers have been great journalists. Camus and Orwell were both journalists.
Churchill.
I think it will reassert itself.
Did you enjoy writing this book?
No, I lost 1.5 inches in height. I got compressed fractures of the spine. God, my back hurt. But I knew that if I went to a doctor, they'd make me do things. So I just kept taking painkillers, and I'd never finish the book. And I found at times it absolutely terrifying to read, because I never did read what was being written about me at the time, and my husband, and I found it painful, excruciating. But in the end, even when you're doing that, there is a love of words, of trying to get the sentence right, of trying to be honest, and that was the hardest thing. When was I pulling my punches? When was I trying to make myself a better person than I am? And I kept going back and thinking, I'm exaggerating how good I was here. I'm not telling them the truth about how bad I was. And So in that there was a certain measure of satisfaction.
And it is a searingly honest book to a truly extraordinary degree. I was reminded of Alan Clark's remark about there's no point in having a discreet diary. Well, this is about the most indiscreet memoirs that it's possible to imagine. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? There's a lady at the... There's a person at the back
It's funny, I don't think of it as indiscreet. I know that sounds coy. No, I don't. I think a life is a life, and you tell it as it is.
Well, it's all right. It's incredibly honest, but there are people, and there are the families of people who've been hurt by it, haven't there?
Well, I think, my publisher really wanted me to leave out the episode in which I maltreated a dog. And when I wrote that episode, I was half crying over it. And the publisher said, you'll never sell any books if you leave this in. And I left it in because I was, at that moment, pathologically horrible. Really horrible. And so it had to be left in, but I suppose that was indiscreet, but it had to be done. I'm sorry.
Equally, you were extremely nice to another dog.
I love
Sorry, there's somebody right at the back.
I have my dog's arm.
I'm afraid you were wrong, Andrew. It's a chap.
Right, that's it. Yeah.
You have a list of friends, a list of enemies. Has anyone in your life been on your list of enemies and ended up on your list of friends?
No. And they never will. My husband is more forgiving. I have this quality of remembering, and I cannot forgive what was done to him. I will tell you this. I lost one of the closest friends I had, not because of the list of friends and enemies. In fact, she was on the list of friends, but because when a book is serialized, and I can't claim that I'm an innocent, a babe in the woods, but the book was serialized by the Daily Mail, for which I was very grateful. I got a chunk of money. But I didn't know how things were serialized in Britain. And they take a sentence from here and a paragraph from here, and then they stitch it together and they make a collage. And so they can make something sound much more sensational than it was. And what was written hurt the person in question in the serialization. And I don't believe she went on to read the book, or she would have seen that it was outweighed by the very good things I said about the same person. So that hurt me. But so I regret that a friend became an enemy, but those on the enemies list can go to bloody hell.
Wonderful. Well, we're all going to have an opportunity now to go and buy this fabulous book. Unless there's any other questions, I'm going to say thank you so much, Barbara, for this fantastic series.